Yes, my name is David Harvey, and I teach here at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'll introduce my colleague here, Setha M, who also teaches at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And our purpose here is to talk a little bit about right to the city, about the role of public space, privatization, and issues of that kind. So Setha, maybe you'd like to say a few things on this topic.
Okay. Well, hello to everyone. I guess I'll say it's very sad that we're not with you, but here we are virtually. And here at the Graduate Center, there are so many of us who are really interested in the city and who has a right to be in the city and how that's expressed in particularly public space. As you know, both David and I work on a number of scales, but most recently I've been particularly concerned with what is happening in public space, both here in the United States and in Latin America, and have been actively involved in Habitat 3, and the new urban agenda that was just passed by the UN. And the part of what we were working on collectively, people from all over the world, was to make sure that the words right to the city, taken heavily from David Harvey and also from Henri Lefebvre, would be part of what we would hope the best cities and the most just cities would be. And there was also a lot of new language about what that might mean and how that might look. What do we mean when we think about social justice in the city? What do we think about equity in public space? And how can public space be a kind of spine to the city, a framework where people can come together? And I've been particularly concerned, as I was saying to David, and some of you know from some of my writings, about the ways in which the right to the city and public space and the right to it and the ability to be in it has been, in some parts of the world, has been eroded. Like, for instance, here in New York, some forms of privatization have worked actually against all kinds of people being together. And also then there's been this question through the new urban agenda, well, what does it mean, all? And what does it mean, equity? And what are we talking about? So
yeah, I had some disputes over that.
Oh, good. Let's talk about that.
I felt the UN language, which of course goes back to the UN Declaration on Human Rights,
exactly.
Was very much colored by the idea that it was individual right to the city that was involved, and so the Habitat 3 declaration on that rather took that kind of line, and that therefore it was about individual access, it was about individual capacities to use the use the resources of the city however individuals wanted. But for me, all along, I've always thought of the right to the city as a collective project, and that therefore for me I was rather sad to see that the sorts of things that I think Lefebvre had in mind, and certainly the things I had in mind, were essentially co-opted, as it were, by United Nations speak, so it became an individual question rather than talking about institutions through which collective rights to the city might be affected. And again, one of the key points in my own writings about the right to the city has been to say it's not simply a right to what exists, it's also a right to change
and the future,
the city into something which is more consistent with our own wants, needs, and desires. So, and I think that aspect of the question got waylaid, as it often does when things get turned into official
But the activists among us, we feel we'd rather have the language there, even though it's true.
Yes.
I mean, you're really quite right, because housing comes up, and there were a whole lot of arguments. It certainly has, and in fact, when I teach Right to the City, I really try to talk about the problem with it being about individual rights. And actually, I prefer the term social justice at this point for my own practice and teaching, because it doesn't have this kind of individual take. On the other hand, I think those of us who were fighting for the best language, or some language that recognized the kinds of diversities and equalities we were looking for, we thought at least if we got it in there, it can be redefined in the collectivity.
Well, though it's rather difficult, I think, to
do that?
take something like, take housing, for example.
Okay.
I mean, certainly in many parts of the world, the right to housing is seen as a right to private property.
Well, that's true, and that gets us,
And again, that gets you into the point where it is about an individual, or in this case, family, right to private property, when I'm very much more in favor of exploring collective ways in which secure housing can be secured for
all, or for groups,
and to think of other forms of property rights apart from private property rights, so
like
that
the limited land
trusts and limited equity co-ops and things of this kind. And there are institutions around which pursue that, but they don't generally get discussed.
No, I think, but there's quite a few, and there are a lot of experiments going on now around the world. And even in my own research on co-ops and condominiums, which are private, I'm also finding that they can be, and I think I got this from you, David, you kept saying, where's the other part of it? There are movements towards collectivity and the use of common space that is in fact increasing that sense. And I guess that's why people sometimes ask me, why do I keep hanging on to thinking about public space? I also do research, obviously, on housing, but I think that that's one place that we really can begin to think about a commons and collectivity, as long as we can keep it in whatever we mean by the public realm or the public domain. And then there was this other piece I was thinking about the other day, is the whole question that that Neil Smith, our colleague, was also interested as less so than I was, but the relationship between public space and the public sphere, and this whole idea of opening the public sphere, which here we are being on a camera that will be shown somewhere else, which is a way of trying to open up not just public space in a physical sense, but a public sphere and the dialogue.
Right. And I think that's a very good point there too, that most commons are not totally open. I think there's a mythology about this. The traditional commons was really, in many respects, confined, either in terms of its limitations on its use, limitations of which group in society had common access or common use of it. And I think, again, the idea here would be to say that we understand the ways in which society gets divided, gets segmented. In some ways, there are problems with that, but at the same time, people certainly have a right to come together collectively, set up their own institutions, and then define their commons in the particular way they want to do it. So it's not as if it's just simply private property versus commons, which is for everybody. It's saying what groups in society wish to establish certain kinds of common amongst themselves, and to use that creatively for their own particular uses. I mean, artists do this.
No, I think you've been incredible. For me personally, just in our day-to-day conversations about what is it, gated communities, or over the years, I think that that's something I really have taken away from your work, particularly even early work, the Spaces of Hope, and some of the earlier work, which is, I think we need to think of creatively, that sometimes some of the bounded spaces that we think of as maybe being off or separate or inclusive to some and exclusive to others can also be spaces that produce a kind of commons and a good for that group. And that was something I came to more slowly, in that it's true, I really did look, I guess I've been working so much. I was thinking about, where do we work, where, because I do ethnography, I'm an anthropologist, and David is a geographer, and that doesn't mean so much, except sometimes our methods and ways of thinking and who we, can differ. And if you're working ethnographically, say in parks and plazas as stuff I have, or the design of new urban developments, you're sometimes confronted with this notion of inclusion, exclusion, that some people are not made welcome for a variety of ways and a variety of reasons. reasons, by forms of privatization or securitization, or even just by the very design of the place not being welcoming. So I was, in the beginning, coming from a design background, really concerned about inclusion for all, diversity for all. But I really have taken some of your writings, David, to heart, and beginning to look at some of these more enclosed notions of commons and to see what can come out of that with a potential for the future.
And I mean, again, the idea here would be to try to structure not just simply a particular heterotopic space in a particular way,
I agree with you on that.
To try to actually structure the whole city in such a way that it is an exciting place to be with a great deal of diversity in it. I mean, I think the conflict that exists sometimes between wanting to be egalitarian and therefore everything has to be flat and the same.
Right.
I think
that doesn't work. Yeah.
No, it doesn't work, and it also makes for a very boring city.
Right.
And a very exciting city is a place which is differentiated.
Exactly.
But in which people can actually recognize and enjoy the differentiations.
Exactly.
I mean, to me, one of the most exciting things in a city is to walk around it. I mean, you may be an ethnographer. I'm a walker.
Yeah, well, it's very similar, right? Exactly.
I like to do what the situation is called these derives around the city, you know, and you come across these different spaces, different places where something different is going on.
Right.
And that's one of the things I really appreciate about a very good urban texture.
Well, what's so interesting is that I get asked a lot, what's a good park? I get, because of the design part, and really the very best parks are also parks that allow for a lot of different territories. If you think about Prospect Park, I don't know if you live in Brooklyn, less so Central Park, but Prospect Park is a great example of where there are very different kind of rooms, those of you, who design or different spaces that are in fact work very well, say for mother and children who might be in some kind of seclusion, who are back away from the main scene, or soccer players who need an open field. But at the same time, the best designs also have some kind of roadway or some way to mix, and that's of course what the city has. It has the roadways and the sidewalks, so you can walk from one space to another and move through it so that there's contact but not homogeneity at all moments. I mean, I think that's a great model.
Right. No, if we can do that. I mean, the best parks I know.
Rights,
so it is about collective rights.
Well, that's complicated. I mean, all right, let's go to collective rights, because I've been trying to think about it. I mean, I can see it, as I said, in a condominium, but those are still private rights. How do we think about right to the city, not as an individual, but collectively? How do and groups that want to somehow make the city?
Well, I think the collective rights really get connected to interests.
Okay. So give me an example.
For example, in Bolivia, I come across a situation where there are different neighborhoods, and they have but the different neighborhoods are in argument with each other, but differentiated from each other. Each neighborhood has its own assembly, and so they have an assembly.
That's
kind
a political organization, like a committee or a neighborhood comité.
But it's cut across by assemblies of a different kind. So all of the street vendors have their own assemblies. So there are street vendors all around the city, but so it's cut across in a different way. So in a way, there are different perspectives on the city and the different assemblies.
And their cultural difference, right? Too.
Some of which are around sort of divisions of labor, some of which are around territorial configurations.
And temporality, if it's vendors too, probably,
And so decisions are then made which about how things should be partitioned amongst, say, all the street vendors. So they have a collective interest in both how they are regulated, but how they regulate themselves. And I think that one of the principles we would want to look to here is to try to find ways in which populations of different sorts want to regulate themselves. And I think that and make their own decisions. And I think that, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're exclusionary of each other. I mean, one of the interesting ways in which it works in something like in Bogota is kind of saying, well, or in La Paz, and in El Alto is well how these different segments come together. So all the merchants have a thing, all the street vendors have something, all the transport people have something, and then there are neighborhood organizations as well. So the more you can create a rather complex density of social relating, the more these things can work together.
Well, this is kind of intersectionality, as they say in feminist speak.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it is, but a different kind. I mean, I know this is a conference on gender, and so, I mean, I'm not, is gender the same, or is it a different kind of collectivity? I mean, I think that's an interesting question. If we look at issues, at least in the United States, let me take the United States, class or race, or some of the social structural, one would argue, barriers, constraints to collectivity. Are those also collectivities, or when they're not so production based? Or I can really see the vendors in Costa Rica. Certainly, or even here in New York City, worked with vendors to try to have some kind of collective right to the city that is at variance sometimes with the users of my classes.
I think, for instance, the collectivity that exists around caring.
Okay.
Is a very good example of how, so the care workers
could come together,
and that wouldn't even necessarily exclude those people who are doing it on a family unpaid basis and those people who are doing it on a paid basis. So you could have a collectivity of caring for the aged or caring for kids.
That's interesting.
And actually you see this with informal networks of sharing, picking up kids after school or looking after kids after school or something of this kind.
And then the collective right there would be to make the city, to create a city to recreate, to facilitate the care. I mean, I talk about even care in public space. I don't think our public spaces, I talk about these 5 social justice propositions in public space that I think would make for a more just city in general. And one of the issues is an ethic of care in general.
Yes.
So even if you look at it in social justice possibilities, you're looking at it very concretely. How do we make the city a place where those involved in care can, in fact, do care, be in public, et cetera, et cetera. There could be a lot we could do.
And those that need care can sometimes get into those spaces and know where to go and where to get it.
That might be really interesting. Certainly with public space, I have to honestly say, people who need care have a very hard time getting there, and there's very few spaces that are protected or secure enough. I think mothers with children would say the same in certain parts of the city, not necessarily New York, but if we look, if we look more generally globally, that there are lots of spaces that women and children don't feel comfortable in, and that if we had a city that was really thinking about a collectivity of care, a right to care, that's very interesting.
You could have care spaces.
We could have, seriously, that would be very interesting. But what I was sort of saying too, so for you that the collectivities would be around what you do, your practice, in anthropologist language, practice, activity, production.
Yeah, your interests,
and
I think it's not just simply about
capabilities.
Jobs. It's not simply about jobs. It's about what people's wants, needs, and desires are in terms of the form that daily life takes.
Okay.
To me, the politics of daily life is a terribly important
thing
to think of. And the politics of that life, of daily life, is taken up with questions of, for instance, just gender.
That's what we come back to. Yes. What about the constraints? I guess one of the things in public space, and the reason the social justice, the propositions and all the time I've spent on that, is that for certain groups in the United States and in Latin America are in many ways excluded, both intentionally and unintentionally, say from public space, something very simple. And often it's along these social structural lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, other these things. So those groups may or may not have interests in common. Your idea of interest. I know Saskia Sassen's, I think, presenting a paper on I think she's going to look at capabilities. So she's using the capabilities, which also Susan Feinstein also uses. Thinking and talking about strategic gendering is what she's talking about. And it's a little different, but that the idea is not interest, but the capabilities of people, that, you know, what it is that they can do. Interest does seem a little broader and more flexible. I'm just wondering, my concern is, will interest could it ever be powerful enough politically or as groups to either go around, undercut structural barriers that might be either in the environment, already in the environment, which they are in most, physically in the environment, or in terms of social relations?
Well, I've never thought of a city as a place that is free of conflict.
Okay, so let's talk about conflict. All right.
I've always thought of a city as being a place where conflictual interests are constantly clashing.
Me too, we're together on that, yeah.
And actually, a lot of those clashes are interesting. And they're sometimes what gives the city its character and its vibrancy.
Well, and allows for some kind of change, right?
But and those differences have to be negotiated. And as somebody like Raymond Williams would say, it has to be negotiated carefully and all the way. I mean, and of course, what we really do want to avoid is violence, and the idea that there are non-negotiable differences. We have to actually always kind of think about the negotiation. That doesn't mean that everything has to end up in a harmonious state.
Okay.
There's a utopian vision often around that the perfect city is a city of perfect harmony, and I think harmonious cities it would be very boring.
Well,
so I think that but I think that the wise planning practice, it seems to me, should be about trying to set up the mechanisms of negotiation, but also the mechanisms that understand the proliferation of difference.
Right. No, I totally in agreement. I think, early on in my very early work on the plaza, I used to talk about it. We really need forums, relatively safe and stable forums for conflict, places where people can come together and conflict with minimum violence, if no violence. And because, so for instance, even in the gated communities, part of the fear that at least Americans and Latin Americans feel about others is that they have no contact with one another. They don't even have contact with the people who live in their own neighborhood. And this lack of contact, this lack of conflict, that if there's a conflict, it's taken care of by some a corporate entity or a board or a bureaucratic unit, so that people don't come into contact with one another, and more there become fear of others, and it becomes less and less, there's less social solidarity. So, conflict seems, cooperation of course, but conflict too is really basic, and ethnographically you can show that is absolutely fundamental to having the kind of vibrant urban spaces, and I would say a vibrant public sphere in terms of ideas and groups being recognized. It's really basic. On the other hand, I think that at least in a city like here in New York, when I say, well, there needs to be some conflict, or you say that conflict is good,
right.
I had the president one time of this university, not this one, but one we had, really get upset with me. We were talking, and she says, well, you can't want to have conflict. And I tried to explain that conflict is, people are not all the same. We don't all want the same things. We don't all have the same interests. What we need are ways in which we can talk about it, and places to talk about it. And if we don't have public spaces that are open in some ways and safe for this kind of conversation, I don't,
but we know, if you call a public meeting about some issue and everything is harmonious and there's nothing to discuss, why does anybody bother to go to the public meeting?
Right. But it usually
they'll go to the public meeting when there's something conflictual.
Right.
Somebody wants to do something, and other people are kind of saying, no, you can't do it, and no. But then they get to know each other that way.
And a lot is learned, right?
And a lot is learned about each other, and this is a way of, it's a form of mode of social integration, whereas, if everybody's happily harmonious, they don't bother to go to anything. And the result of that is, and this is kind of one of the themes that I'm very interested in these days, is the whole kind of question of alienation.
People who are just pulling away. That's an old idea, you know?
I know it's an old idea, but I want to put it back a bit and say,
World War II.
alienation in the city. And actually, I think we've got a lot of alienated populations right now who are kind of, you know,
you think that's what
not involved with each other. I mean, one of the reasons I don't like gated communities, that you know a great deal about it, is that they isolate themselves.
Right.
And you get, in a sense, an alienated consciousness. So that when something comes up, they kind of say, doesn't bother me, it's not my business, I'm just going to, you know, continue to sort of watch my TV show or whatever. And therefore sociality disappears.
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that's going on in New York is we are overall more heterogeneous, but yet the neighborhoods are more homogeneous.
Yes.
There's more separation between different kinds of either people or activities or interests than ever before. Now, that's also true in Bogota. I mean, I don't know at Caracas, it's certainly true.
Right.
All right. So we've got a situation in which the city itself is seen as incredibly diverse, and yet the interaction is not.
Yeah, but the big difference between, say, New York and Baltimore, which I'm familiar with both,
some of it,
is that in Baltimore there is not much contact.
At all. And here there's lots. We have a subway. We have a subway.
Yeah, we travel, we see each other.
Every
we know
day.
We're there every day. And,
it's a good thing.
And I looked at sort of kids raised in Baltimore who get stuck in suburban environments, and they don't even know the inner city, and they don't come in contact with anything, and they think, you know. Whereas in New York City, it's in your face all of the time. And even though you may live in an area that is fairly separate and that, but you can't avoid it.
That's my big thing. Remember the different places in the, like if you take Prospect Park, that walkway everybody uses. Well, our subway everybody uses. There are all kinds of places where all the different networks overlap. I mean, I live in a place right now where there are complete networks that have no spaces of intersection, particularly between Latinos and non-Latinos, and there are just almost no contact spaces.
But you mentioned, for instance, the park. You know, out there.
The park.
I mean, the different groups in the park in itself. I mean, people are seeing each other.
Well, and then they walk
you don't
through
have,
the loop. They do see each
other. There's a park in Baltimore, for example, which is only one group.
Right. Where is it? Yeah, I lived there. Nobody goes there.
Nobody else apart from that group goes there, and it's their park, and that's it. So there's no contact. Now, which kind of park do I think we should be trying to get? Obviously, Prospect Park is the kind of thing, and I've seen similar parks like that. In Quito has a wonderful one like that.
Quito has a wonderful park.
Which is full of, you know, all
everybody.
Everybody.
We were just there.
And,
both of us were just there.
Yes, right. Yeah, and it's a fabulous kind of park, particularly on Sundays. Almost every group in the city has its corners,
place.
And they're playing different music here. And somebody's, I mean, I even saw them playing the English game of cricket, and I thought, oh my God, cricket being played in Ecuador, that is ridiculous. But there it was, and so in that sense, there is this sense of diversity and contact, which is there.
Well, and what I'm asked often by people, New Yorkers sometimes, especially I would say more wealthy New Yorkers, when I'm talking about distributive justice, getting money, say from our Central Park gets the most money, and that it's highly taxed and there's a conservancy. At any rate, and I've been advocating that 15% of that money go to other parts of the city that are not as wealthy, let's say. And one of the things that we get in arguments about is why this matters. Why I think it matters, as do you agree with me, that Prospect Park or places that have a diversity, that is a safe environment where people have their own territories but still really can mix and come into contact with one another, that it has an impact on society in general. That if we don't see each other, don't have some conflict with each other, you end up with a society that has a certain amount of disintegration or pulling apart, and you're going to using that older word, alienation, and maybe that is the right word. Again, my objection to alienation is an individual term. It's like that old anomie. But regardless, the question is that I've had a very difficult time convincing some of the people who are the decision makers, some of the planners, some of the architects, or some of the times the municipal people who to say, why does this matter? It seems to me really important that we can communicate why this is so important.
And
what
I
do you
think,
say?
yeah, well, you've just got to go out and make the argument. You're good at making the argument. So I mean, that's the point of these things. And in exactly the same way that you and I are making this argument, and this is a public forum, and so it seems to me terribly important to express this.
Right.
Because otherwise, people kind of, if they think that the best thing to do with the park is to make it homogeneous and absolutely secure just for one particular group or something of that kind, then that fails, it seems to me, in terms of its vision.
Maybe, but I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about culture. I know that I got emails from the organizers or some people that people might be interested in sort of the issue of urban planning and culture, or urban planning and religion, and different societies are structured really differently, and how do we think about right to the city by interests or collectivities, or even how do we think about these things in situations in which culture varies a lot, or in which the history and the politics of the country varies a lot. I mean, I think then we get into some trickier, more complicated questions. Would it make sense in a society where a group of people did not have access to, say, public space, to have a public space that was safe for them to use? I don't know. Are these ways of solving it? It goes very much against the kind of theorizing we're talking about here. But the world is not all the same. How do we think our way through the kinds of differences that we face in different parts of the world?
Well, I guess my approach to that is to say, look, I've never liked the idea that the planner or is some authority there that is endowed with the decision to do this or do that. To me, it seems important to start with whatever's going on around you, then to sort of push things this way or that way, and eventually big decisions about the park will come out.
Collaborate with the local people.
And it operates in very specific ways. I mean, I lived in this area in Baltimore where there was a park in front of me, and when I was walking the dog, I would go out, and I come with certain background from sort of respectable English working class that doesn't like litter around, and so there's litter in the park, and so I was in the habit of picking it up every now and again, and also picking up after my dog, which a lot of people didn't do. So I'm out there, and I notice that other people are out there. I get into conversations with people, and very soon we start to organize so that we have a clean the park out litter clearing day. And so the city was persuaded to bring a big sort of dumpster along,
so you could put
we could put everything we could find, and we found all kinds of things, in the park. But then some people were dumping things in the park, and some people. So we had a wonderful thing where half of the people were dumping trash in the park.
Right, exactly.
And the other half is taking trash out of the park.
We definitely have that.
So we get into some sort of educative thing, and a couple of the people in the group kind of started going around talking to the kids in the schools about not leaving trash in the park, and not, so yeah. But this is the way the thing went, and the city was running out of money, so it started to abandon any kind of care of the park. So actually some of the people started to do their own care of the park.
Stewardship, we call that. Stewardship, encouraging stewardship.
So then people had different ideas as to how to actually manage the park.
That's right.
And some people said you should go out and you should get rid of species that were not native.
Oh dear.
So this
the indigenous species
yes, indigenous species. So I remember having a big argument. I said this is like ethnic cleansing, and of course people got very upset at that. But I kind of said, just because it's an invasive species, maybe it's been there for 2 centuries, you can't sort of get rid of it, And other people had different views about how to whether you should clip the
Right.
the vegetable,
right.
and it should be all neat, or whether it was.
We have big fights where I live. There are big fights in my homeowners association.
But isn't this exactly?
Exactly.
So you don't want some authority to come in and say it has to be like this.
I see what you're saying. You're saying that any community in and of itself will develop its own process.
We will develop our own process, and I'm on one side of this.
Right, and I might be on the other.
I get.
I think I'm
they wanted to get rid of these.
I'm the non-clipper, but I don't like non-indigenous species.
I'm a non-clipper, and somebody came along and clipped these, and I kind of said, those plants are the kinds of plants that butterflies
right.
are light
the butterfly
on.
bush, yes, exactly,
in
right.
the big butterfly migration, you've now destroyed it because either it was not an indigenous or because
it was too. It gets very rambling. Butterfly bush gets really wild. It doesn't look nice.
It doesn't look nice and neat, So we would have these arguments, and I think that this is how the management of a park space should be designed, as opposed to having a management which is sort of the city's policies is that it has to be this or it has to be that.
But then what's the role of the planner? What's the role of the city? I mean, I think that's part of it.
Issues may arise, and I'm not arguing that there's no space for expert opinion. I mean, we had a stream in the park, and there were questions about the engineering of the erosion and dealing with the erosion that was going on, and dealing with the problems of stream flow, which were being exacerbated by the fact that people put concrete, put it in a channel.
Right, they didn't have runoff things.
Then it came down like and
it
started to do serious erosion. So, I mean, there are engineering skills where you want somebody to come in and say, well, if you do this, then you're likely to run into that. And so I think the role of the state and the role of the experts is important here, but it's mainly to assist, to provide information on the basic decision-making structure.
Yeah. Well, I've been teaching, at Pratt a little bit with these new masters who are studying placemaking, believe it or not, and that's the term they're using. I'm not sure if that's the best term, but it seems to be spreading again, this idea of planners who are being trained in ethnography, amongst other things, but also in social theory, social justice theory, and equity, and that they see their goals as just exactly what you're talking about, of trying to create a sensitive kind of planning that works with communities on the ground. On the other hand, as you well know, we live in a city here in New York, at least, and I would again throw in Caracas, Bogota, some of the Panama City, whatever, where there is also a city planning department that is developing master plans that lay out what can be where and how, and requires a kind of either expertise, but also then exercises value judgments about things like culture or gender or whatever. I guess what I still feel and where I would like to have more impact is at that level, and at the level of the negotiations with urban developers, private developers who come in. How can we have a master plan that is informed by the interests of people who live in the city, and at the same time be able to, may I use the word rein in, but to have some ways in which there can be private developments, and so many cities depend on it, but in which that private development really is for the benefit of all, or of the greater good.
Or even
that's a big problem.
or even more important, let's suppose we, just to go back to the housing thing.
Okay, let's do housing.
We're interested in community land trusts or something of that kind.
Or limited growth.
Well, there's no way I can set that up, or you can set that up. You need the help of the city. And the city has to be, favorable towards these kinds of things.
Has to be committed to some kind of common.
So they can say, look, if a group of people want to set up a community land trust, we will assist them. And there's a wonderful system of social housing I came across in Uruguay. which say a union or something of that kind, its members decide they want to have their own collective housing. So they set up social housing, and there are two ways they can get into the housing. They can either donate their labor or they can put in money. But the city comes along and helps them find the land.
Wow.
The city comes along with some basic engineering skills. The university provides some architectural skills and assistance and things like this, and how to do this and how to do that. But then the social housing is basically self-built by the people who are going to live there. It's not market housing.
It's below market housing.
No, it can't be sold.
It's got a cap, or is it
not? No, it's permanently out of the market. So, and then people can come in and come out depending upon what you put into it.
You keep a certain level of affordable housing.
Yes, affordable housing, and it keeps affordable housing. It's self-created, but the people who do it often provide the labor. And they can continue to live there by providing the labor of maintenance and all the rest of it. They often get some training in construction skills.
Then they now have a better job prospects.
So the state, the local state, has roles to play in providing, but it's clearly there. But the state has to be willing to do this kind of thing.
Right. I mean, I think, and also different states and different cities. It's not even the whole nation. It's often cities themselves
cities
have very different ideas of how they want to develop. I mean, we know that under Bloomberg, he was really very interested in creating a kind of what Julian Brash has called a luxury city, and that he wanted more developers to come in, and in fact we have such incredible things like the High Line or the Brooklyn Bridge Park. On the other hand, that's money that didn't get distributed. I don't know where you are on this, but it's money that it did make New York more of a tourist haven, and it certainly is. These are beautiful places. I'm not saying that, but and it did take land that didn't have value and gave it tremendous amount of value, plus all the land around it. On the other hand, nothing was done in terms of the distribution of that, and that was money that could have renovated all the small parks in the Bronx and the Brooklyn. I mean, in all of our, we have large areas of the city that are not in downtown Manhattan and are not where the tourists go, but where people are living their everyday lives where they don't necessarily have parks. So there is that kind of social justice problem when you get into development, and each city has to make up their own mind about these things. I think we should wind down. I was going to start talking about that even in the best of all circumstances where we're renovating parks or housing, we can also increase the amount of gentrification in which people get dislocated. So that's something that we're all very interested in, certainly all over what I call the New World. South America, certainly it's just as evident as we're seeing it in the United States. But maybe we should sort of wind down. I wish we knew what questions people had, but we don't.
Well, the question and answer session is always probably the most interesting, but it also can be sometimes the most bizarre. So we'll just have to wind down, I think, right now. And
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. This was fun. This is something we don't get to do very often, and
it's a good excuse for us to do it.
Yeah, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I guess we probably get emails. I mean,
we'll see
if you want to see. So thank you so much.